Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome, everyone. I am thrilled and have a great honor today in welcoming Rear Admiral Dave Oliver to discuss his new book. Rear Admiral Oliver is a 1963 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy who spent 32 years in the Navy. He served at sea on diesel-electric and nuclear submarines, commanded a nuclear submarine, and then served as Chief of Staff of the 7th Fleet. During the Clinton administration, he served as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. And in the Bush administration, he was the Director of Management and Budget for coalition forces in Iraq. He also held various positions in the defense industry. So we'll focus on his book, A Navy Admiral's Bronze Rules, which I read over the past week. It's a fascinating look at case studies to explore the inherent risks of leadership and the tools available to those who nevertheless wish to shoulder those responsibilities, which can be daunting. So he looks at various aspects of the Yom Kippur War, the background of the 1986 bloodless revolution in the Philippines, how Admiral Bud Zumwalt was a unique Chief of Naval Operations, and then our National War Plan and its revisions under the Reagan administrations, and then actually finally what spurred President Bill Clinton's anti-nuclear proliferation successes. But before I hand this over to Admiral Oliver, I did want to highlight a quote and read a quote from the 19th Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, who wrote about the book that we'll be discussing today. Quote, Dave Oliver had a ringside seat for some of the most significant events that attended the collapse of the Soviet Union. This fascinating book describes some of those events. In reading the book, you will learn that Dave was not only an observer, but a doer. Indeed, some of these remarkable events may never have occurred had it not been for Dave's bold actions. That's high praise from Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. So with that, I will turn it over to Admiral Oliver. He'll provide an overview using slides of his book and some of the main conclusions, and then I will engage in a Q&A discussion with him. So Admiral Oliver, I turn this over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, SF. The public expects each of us to be competent managers, and goodness knows that is quite often a challenge. But secretly, most of us yearn, I think, to be known as great leaders. And often we search for a key that might unlock a passage to that vault of knowledge. Emma, would you go to slide 2? I believe that the important factor to recognize is that this secret room that we're searching for is different for each of us. It has the two characteristics that are on the top of this slide, but varies for each person precisely because we are individuals. None of us is Attila the Hun, or General Electric's Jack Welch, or General Colin Powell. While we may respect the three, although I have always personally had my reservations about Jack Welch after he tried to get President Clinton to overturn my decision on the Honeywell merger. And the books about the leadership are not bad. We are not they. My talk about today discusses that of the 35 case studies that I hope you will agree, there are 3 that I'm going to discuss that I think are linked. First of all, let me go all the way back to 1973. Emma, slide 3. The next slide, please. This is the long, hot summer before the Yom Kippur War, which is the 4th war that shaped Israel the way we know it. As you remember, and this was a long time, perhaps before some of you were even born, Vietnam had ended in April. Watergate was really just getting started. The burglars had been sentenced in January, but Butterworth, the guy who had installed the taping system, had just told the Congress that that taping system existed. And so the events that would lead to the president being threatened with being impeached and President Nixon leaving office had just been put into gear. The vice president, Spiro Agnew, who had been taking bribes for tens of years, had just told the president in July that he was under indictment, or was going to be under indictment. The president didn't believe it, but Al Haig, who was his chief of staff, had told him he did believe that Spiro Agnew would be convicted, and in fact, the vice president would resign in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. The Secretary of State, which was Mr. Rogers, whom the president was a good friend of the president's, but the president didn't care about state because he just thought it was too soft in communism, had been fighting with Mr. Kissinger. Kissinger had just pushed out Rogers and become head of the Secretary of State in August. And bad intelligence, what bad intelligence refers to is that Mr. Kissinger had announced that there would be no war. There would be no war with Israel. That Arab nations were not going to attack it. And he told the Joint Chiefs of Staff that they were not to do anything to help Israel. And of course, you had the Middle East Armaments Board in Congress, which was insisting that things would be balanced. And so the word was out that nothing was to happen in the Middle East. Next slide. However, there was at least one man who was going to make a difference. Now, at the time, there was a thing called a Sidewinder missile, which was the best air-to-air missile that existed in the world. And as true with all best of things, it had been invented a counter to direction. In other words, Bill McLean, Dr. Bill McLean, who worked at China Lake, which is a research facility in California, had been directed not to build it. And it hadn't been an approved Navy project, but he built it in his garage, and it turned out to be the greatest thing since sliced bread if you wanted to kill an airplane with an infrared missile. And it got him, it was so good, it was even the Air Force used it. And we sold it to all of our allies. And we started making modifications. In August of 1973, we were up to modification Lima, or the AIM-9 Lima. And what this one did is it meant that you could kill aircraft head on with the leakage, infrared leakage that escaped from around the back and got into you could see them head on. And this increased the kill by a factor of 18. And I know this because the Chief of Naval Operations called me in. I was a lieutenant commander at the time. He had 21 captains working for him on his personal staff and one lieutenant commander. I was a lieutenant commander. And he called me in and he explained all these things to me. And then he said, there are 1,080 of those modifications in the world, and they're all in a cardboard box down in such and such an office. Go down and get that box and go deliver it to this address, which is about where left field is, where the National Stadium is for those people who are in DC. And for other people, it was a really tough area in Washington at that time. But I was a young man and thought I was invulnerable. And CNO told me to do it, so I did it. I got in a car, picked up the box. We weren't wearing uniforms at the time. Because the Vietnam War had just finished. I got out of the car, picked the box up out of the back seat, took about 4 strides, and a bag went over my head, a gun went in my back, and the box went out of my hands. Somebody said, "Keep the bag on your head and don't say anything, and count to 50 slowly, and go back to the Pentagon." When I took the bag off my head, the only thing I could see was a woman about a block away with a 3-wheeled grocery cart walking into an alley. So I went back to the Pentagon and I said to Admiral Zumwalt, I said, "This didn't go that well." And he looked up and I said, "This was stolen." And he said, "Very well." And I thought about it. And I could have gone off and talked to my other 2 bosses, because a lieutenant commander has many bosses in the Pentagon between me and the CNO. But I thought, he hadn't he hadn't called them to talk to him, and I figured it was time to go home and have a bowl of soup. So I really figured, and I did that. Next slide, Emma, please. At 2 p.m. on 6 October, Egypt and Syria sent 135,000 troops and 1,800 tanks against Israel in the Golan Heights and the Suez Canal. And they surprised Israel. It was a surprise attack. Israel lost more troops than they had lost in the 3 previous wars. But Syria and Egypt lost 172 aircraft, and Israel lost 18. And the question is, without complete air superiority, would Israel have been able to gather itself? Because it wasn't until 9 October where Secretary Kissinger finally approved sending arms to Israel. In fact, he approved the sale of Sidewinder missiles. He didn't know about the 9 Lima Mod, but if he had to, would they have had time to, send them over, modify the missiles, test them, and get accustomed to them, et cetera, in the middle of the war? Without Zumwalt's unauthorized August action, would there have been an Israel to save? When Kissinger later said, I saved Israel by my negotiations with Russia, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. My summary of the Iran War case study is this: integrity is always critical, management involves responsibility, leadership entails the risk. Admiral Zumwalt didn't say anything about it, this action in his bio. He didn't say anything at all. In fact, I didn't understand what was going on until the next slide. Well, actually go back one, I'm sorry. I didn't understand what was really going on until when in November, when I tried to get out of my house one morning, and I tried to get out of my house and I couldn't get out of the front door. And I pushed and pushed and nothing happened, so I went out the back door. I went around the front door, and on the front door was a big basket of wine. It was about 4 feet wide, about 3 feet tall, and it was full of Israeli wines. Then on March 12th, 2018, on the occasion of Israel's 70th anniversary, Admiral Bud Zumwalt was recognized by the Israeli embassy in Washington and by the Jewish News Syndicate as one of the 70th greatest American contributors to the U.S.-Israel relationship. He was one of the 70th people. They probably did in alphabetical order. He was listed as number 4. Next. Emma, next slide. This is a picture of Kenya. And I put it there so you can see where it is. It's twice the size of Texas, has double the population of Texas. If you go up to the north and you stop just south of the Arabian Sea, from north to south, you got Oman, Yemen, Somalia, and then Kenya. And to the west of those countries is Saudi Arabia. And Mombasa is a port which is big enough for a carrier, and it's at the south of Kenya. Now, why was Kenya dying? In 1981, AIDS was discovered in California and New York, and it essentially was killing, in the years between we found out it was killing about 80–90% of people who became infected. By 1985, we wouldn't let anybody in the country who had AIDS, and it had gone to, 15,000 people, 12,000 had died. We found it in 66 countries. Now, why it was a challenge for us, and the next challenge for us in the 7th Fleet, I was out in 7th Fleet as Chief of Staff for 7th Fleet. Next slide, Emma, is that the Soviet Union was saying that the United States was spreading drug warfare, and when we looked at Kenya, we thought that in the Pacific, what we did was send people around to the ports to make sure the port was safe to send people into. We went out to look. We were going to send a carrier into Kenya. When we looked there, the guys came back. My fleet surgeon, who was Bill McDaniel, who later became Admiral, came back and said 50 to 60, 70% of the people are dying. We can't send a carrier in there because we're faced with the realities of alcohol and young people and what people do when they're in ports. And we had no help from the Department of Defense because the Department of Defense, actually somebody in the Department of Defense issued a memorandum, somebody senior, saying that AIDS was not communicable. So, next slide. The reason that I identify Paul McCarthy, and he has a picture in my book, as one of the true leaders. And how do you earn this picture? Well, with the advice of Bill McDaniel and me, he tested every sailor in the fleet, which was expensive, because we wanted to find out were we really generating AIDS throughout the Pacific. And then we wanted to get the sick sailors back to CONUS so they didn't transfer it to other people, and so that we could actually treat them. The question you might have is, was this popular with his boss, Think Back Fleet, that 4-star? No, that 4-star actually called the captain, who was a Surgeon General, and told him he was not to do this, and screamed at him. And then he screamed at Admiral McCarthy. Was it the right thing to do? Of course it was the right thing to do. And in fact, once we'd identified the people, which as I recall was something like 160 of them, we found that some of them knew they were infected, thought they were dying, and were going out and trying to have sex with every male and female they could find to try to spread the disease so the other people would die along with them. Next slide. This comes back to my 2 main points. Integrity is always most important than anything else. It's more important than not believing. Part of all this got bound up with whether or not you believed there were homosexuals in the Navy, and of course there were homosexuals in the Navy, and whether or not you believed that people had sex, and of course people were having sex. And this comes down to management involves responsibility, but leadership involves risk. Paul McCarthy put his stars in a line, and what he said, as I say in my book, he said, we're going to do this. If you want to get somebody else out here to replace me, we'll do what you say, bring him out. Next slide. In December 1977, the CIA director terminated 820 covert analysts and operators. Why? Well, he did it because both political parties agreed that we had too many nasty spies around. This is left from Kennedy trying to take over Cuba with the CIA and it not working out because it was a stupid idea, right? And then we had President Reagan getting in trouble down in South America, also trying to do something covert with the CIA that was stupid. So what they decided, the problem must be the CIA had too many covert people. So we'll do it with gloves off. We'll do it with national means or satellites. So we'll terminate we've got some satellites, which are called keyhole satellites, which take pictures. So we'll terminate the covert analysts. Now, to give Stanfield Turner his due, before he died, he decided that was wrong. He wrote that. But life is always awkward. So in January '88, a month after he decided to terminate people, a CIA agent went over to the Soviets and took the keyhole satellite tech manual with him and gave it to the Soviets. Unfortunately, Admiral Turner made a finding that the Soviets would gain little value from access to that manual. And later on that year, his president he was working for signed an agreement saying that we could do another SALT agreement, following up on President Nixon's SALT agreement, both of which were based on that the U.S. would determine what the Soviets had by national means. In other words, by satellites and by U-2 flights, etc. Okay, next slide. Now, the problem is, see this? This is Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has the longest border between Russia and the longest border with China. It's an interesting little place. And that's where the Soviet Union had both their space station, that's where they put most of their missile fields, and it was a desolate area. It was a hard area to monitor. And the Soviets are able to use those major fields and to know where the satellites flew and to make some calculations because they have computers too and they have slide rules. And they figured out, knowing what that KH-11 could see, they figured out how to keep their city busters. In other words, they were supposed to be removed, and they figured out how to hide them in the mountains. And we had no idea for probably 10 years. And since we had reduced them down to about 3,000, they gained a great advantage over us. We didn't know this until the president of Kazakhstan was worrying about the Soviet Union was breaking up. And the president of Kazakhstan was worrying about the fact that President of Russia, Yeltsin at the time, would remember and say, I don't want the U.S. to know we violated SALT. I'll take over Kazakhstan so they can't tell him. So the president of Kazakhstan smuggled himself and another member of the Politburo into the United States. But nobody in the Congress would talk to him. He tried to talk to Senator Dole, just running for president. He wouldn't talk to him. So late one evening, about 1 o'clock in the morning, while in the middle of a snowfall, a friend of somebody from the Sorbonne who had a big shipping line called me in the middle of the night and said, do you want 100 nuclear weapons, city buster nuclear weapons, and a couple thousand pounds of plutonium? And I said yes, and I knew her, and so I go down to what turned out to be a Chinese safe house and meet these two people and talk to them and tentatively negotiate a deal for the U.S. to buy, anyway, to do a trade deal in exchange for these weapons. Now the problem is, I really don't know that these are members of the Soviet. I don't know that they're president of Kazakhstan and a senior member of the Soviet Politburo. Right? They have business cards, but I don't know who the hell they are. And I am a 2-star admiral working for the Navy, but they say they have to catch the afternoon flight back to Kazakhstan because they have riots in Kazakhstan. I know that's going true. So I steal the salt and pepper shakers off the door, and there's some other things. There's some guns involved, and that sort of thing. And I go out to CIA where I knew I had the #3 guy. I wait for him to come in his car, stop him in the snow, give him the salt shakers, and have him go check it out. Ask him to check out the fingerprints. Go in, talk to the DIA who doesn't want me to do it. Talk to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations who tells me not to do anything about it. Talk to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who tells me not to do anything about it. And go in and talk to Bill Perry, who gets his staff together, and all of them recommend we don't do anything about it. And fortunately, about that time, the head of the CIA calls and wants to know what David Oliver is doing with the fingerprints from the president of Kazakhstan. And Bill Perry decides to go talk to President Clinton. And as a result of all this, next page. The next page. There's an interesting decision here in my mind, which was that, of course, the decision about the tech manual was a bad decision. And was it affected by the fact the president just made the decision on technical means, or the fact that it was a CIA employee who had just gone over, or was the fact the high cost of the KH-11, which if those of us in the business of that will tell you, you're talking $8 to $15 billion. Next slide. But when President Clinton, when Bill Perry and President Clinton decided to talk to the president of Kazakhstan, because of the early morning breakfast that I had, as much plutonium was removed in the world as has been done through any previous SALT negotiation. Next slide. So we have 3 different case studies, 3 different forms of leadership. AIDS, numbered fleet commander makes a decision counter to his boss, counter to the direction from Washington. You save I don't even know how many lives you saved. We stopped the Soviet Union from talking about germ warfare. We enhanced the reputation of the U.S. Yom Kippur War, I think it's an open question about how much the security of Israel was enhanced or maybe saved. Nuclear weapons, the nuclear clock was certainly pushed back. And the question is, and obviously, and sometimes the failure to follow law of order can be a right thing. Next thing. Next slide, Emma. So in summary, we get back to the same thing, 2 things. Integrity is always important, and leadership entails risk. You need to know yourself, what your psychic needs are, and what your skills are. And you always need to challenge yourself to grow and acquire new skill tools, because you're always going to be challenged. Okay, Seth, that's all yours.
Great, Admiral Oliver. Thanks for the overview of the book. We've got a couple of questions here. Let me start off with sort of a broad one on your decision to write it. I mean, you obviously had a diverse career, which I laid out at the beginning of this discussion, on subs, on the civilian side of the Pentagon, in the defense industry. And it would be helpful to hear briefly what actually triggered you to write this book on leadership. Why did you write it? Why now? And then I got one follow-up from that. So can you talk a little bit about why?
I wrote my first leadership book in 1990 because I thought I was still in the Navy, and I thought that the submarine force Admiral Rickover was a harsh man, and the submarine force became too harsh and too mean. They let officers who were mean get to the top, and you don't need to be mean to be good leaders. And I was trying to reorient the submarine force to have better leadership. And so I wrote that then. I then wrote this. I actually wrote this 4 years ago, but I had trouble. I had some disagreements with the publisher and et cetera. And I had disagreements over various things because people had troubles with the subject matter. I thought we should talk about integrity more. And I thought it was really important to talk about integrity. And I also thought there was some history here that had not been published. And I thought that people should talk about the history of what had happened.
Well, we'll get into integrity. We'll get into some of the more recent events we've seen in the U.S. in a moment. But before we get there, I think it would be helpful. One of the things you didn't mention in your overview was, and I think it's important to unpack this a little bit for the listeners here, is who is your shadow and how does that figure into leadership? And for those who haven't read it yet, a little bit of context on your shadow, because your shadow becomes an important part of the book.
Leadership in many ways is very personal and very private. And there are points, for example, when I was in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. when I stepped out of talking to the president of Kazakhstan in the middle of a snowfall, and I don't know, candidly, I was shaken because what I don't talk about is all the guys had guns, and I had just been through a whole bunch of things with it, and I did not know what I was going to do, how I was going to prove. So to go out and stand in the snowfall and try to determine the number 3 guy at the CIA through the windshield of his car, and it was about 6 degrees at the time. And that was my only hope to be able to prove who it was. And then have each of the senior authorities, including the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, order me not to do anything more with that. That causes a certain reflection. In other words, you have to go down deep inside and say, am I going to risk everything on whether or not I judge this to be right? In other words, loose nukes was important at that period of time, if you happen to reflect back. Is loose nukes important to the world, and am I right and everybody else wrong? And I am going to risk everything on the fact that I'm right and they're all wrong. Well, I refer to that as my shadow. In other words, I'm sort of checking with I refer to as my shadow. The same thing as a story in there about, I was in Iraq, and I had told Jerry Bremer, that the minister of oil was not dishonest. He just wasn't capable. And Jerry and I actually got along, but Jerry said, the president nominated, I can't send him back. And I said, well, he can't do anything. And Jerry and I had a discussion. And then about 3 days later, Jerry calls me down to his office. And the minister is standing there, the American minister who had run an oil company in Texas. And Jerry says, they're rioting the oil fields. I've got about 50,000 guys out there that are rioting and shooting and burning oil fields. And I said, well, here's a chance for Bob to earn his keep, right? He's hot stuff. And Jerry says, Bob says he doesn't want to go out there. And I said, well, Jerry, you said Bob was cool. And Jerry says, David, you already explained to me that Bob wasn't cool. I'd like you to go solve this. And he says, how many troops do you want? And I said, troops don't. You can't do this with troops. I mean, they got 50,000 guys out there. We don't, we got, give me a megaphone. Give me a megaphone and your driver, and I'll go out there and solve this. And so, you go out there. But when you go out there and you climb up the derrick to talk to everybody, and you have your back to these guys who are shooting, the first 25 feet, when you got your back to them and you're climbing up there, you were sort of talking to yourself, because once you turn around and start talking to people, the problem's solved, right? But in the walk up, candidly, now you guys may be braver than I am, but to walk up, you got to talk to somebody. And I always used to talk to my shadow and say, is this a good idea? And my shadow would say, have you got a better idea? I mean, you're already here. You already said the guy was awful and you could do better. You're there. You know what I mean? So my shadow's the guy I used to talk to.
Sounds a little bit like what some people refer as their conscience, or
I don't know. My conscience wasn't that good. I mean, I read Lady Charlie's Lover. We had an early conversation about that. I mean,
yeah. Let me just turn to some of the implications. You noted in your presentation, you just noted it in the discussion, that part of leadership is, in some cases, defying what you're told, and that you argue in the book that failure to follow a lawful order is not always a bad thing. In fact, you had defied, I think by my count, Kissinger, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the president, among others. I think the question that I think is worth pondering for a moment, and your thoughts are important here, is under what circumstances do you think it is acceptable for someone in uniform not to follow an order? And how do you think through that? Because obviously there are extraordinary costs if you're not right either.
I think you have to decide. You have to be prepared at all times to leave. And if you're not, I used to tell people, if you have a spouse, for example, that you have to take care of and cannot survive without medical care or whatever like that, or something like that, or an aunt or something like that, don't choose a different path, or modify your path. My spouse had an independent career. I was comfortable that I could always make a living. And as a fact, I used to tell people, I knew how to drywall. I actually can work those wedges with my feet and my knees, and I'm actually not bad at drywalling. And you can make $10, $15 an hour. I mean, if all else fails, and I'm willing to do that. I mean, so if you have made that decision, and if you have made that decision seriously, that that's more important to you than whatever else, then it makes it much easier to operate in the manner that I think is a way a true leader should operate.
So,
but I don't recommend it for everybody. But
yeah.
Then I don't believe everybody should be a leader.
Yeah. Well, this does raise. First of all, I'm gonna go hone after this discussion. I'm gonna hone my drywall skills for some backup. But more seriously, let me just raise this issue. There have been a lot of pretty frank discussions over the last year about some civil military issues, including the January 6th incidents. So one question for you is on this broader theme we're talking about right now. Do you pull any lessons from that experience?
Let me not choose that experience, but let me choose another. And to give you, are you familiar with the fact that the safety organization for NASA resigned en masse some months before the Challenger explosion?
Yeah.
But they did so in a quiet letter, right?
That's correct, yeah.
And why? And they're all, and actually I know them all. Why didn't they do it publicly? If they had done it publicly, would those people have lived? I mean, the situation was awful at NASA. Why didn't they resign publicly?
Well, should they have?
Yes. There's no question, is there?
Certainly not in hindsight. So the broad lesson for today is what good leadership in situations like that, if faced with that, is you would resign and do it publicly.
If you don't resign publicly, what's the resignation worth?
That's fair. I wanted to move on briefly and talk about the another issue that comes up repeatedly, which is ethics and integrity as being crucial for leadership. And I think just pulling this to today, there have been challenges, including with the Navy. Why today, and perhaps particularly today, are ethics and integrity important for effective leadership, and how do you make sure that culture exists in the military today?
It always is important. I perhaps would disagree with you on various things, examples, because I believe people, and if you read my book, you'll see, I believe people should take action, and the problem frequently is people have not taken sufficient action, and people think, boy, that guy really did a wonderful job, and people, he got screwed. No, he didn't do it good enough. He did a half action, and he should have been fired. You understand what I'm saying? I think, for example, let's see. Let me give you a very specific. I think it's terrible that the Surface Force eliminated the school in San Diego where they taught people, and went to a group of a set of discs to try to teach kids. I mean, it's terrible. But Surface Force recognized that to try. But I think it's terrible. I think it's terrible that anybody who was in the Navy at that time let that happen, and no matter which community they're in. I mean, it's gross. The young officers who were a product of that, it wasn't nearly their fault nearly as much as it was the admirals who had let it happen. How's that? And actually, that's sort of where the Navy came down. I'm not sure they've been strong enough in building it back up, but
that's fair. I have a question from someone who was a firstie when you were a plebe. And the question is, the report, the fighting culture of the U.S. Naval Surface Force was a reminder of and this is the questioner here, what appear to be continuing leadership problems that probably extend to other services and branches of the Navy. So the question is, do you agree that there, again, continue to be problems, and what would you do to correct them? Again, this was a reference directly to the fighting culture of the U.S. Naval Force.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree that has any reference, and I'm too far removed to comment on existing circumstances.
That's fair. I want to change topics slightly and go back. I think actually, for me, one of the most fascinating of the cases that you highlighted was your experience in helping with the removal of nuclear materials from Kazakhstan. And you talked about it in your opening remarks, and you've given it in a few examples here. What do you say to people in the audience about the importance of following your instincts when making foreign policy decisions? In other words, how would you take that case and encourage people to think through, if they're faced with a similar situation, how they should specifically think about it?
Well, in that case, I immediately brought this back and tried to bring it to the people who supposedly knew better: the Director of Intelligence, Vice Chief of Naval Operations, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. So I finally found somebody who had some sense, right? So I worked it pretty hard and worked it all the way up till I found somebody who knew somebody. So.
And let me ask the counterfactual. What if you'd been wrong? What if the DNA had come back and it was someone else?
Well, then they would have fired me.
And you were okay with that?
Yeah, I'm telling you, I was willing at all times to accept that. You had to be. And at the same time, the question of, I don't, you're younger, you're so much younger, but remember, we were so concerned about loose nukes. When the war ended, the Soviets had 50 to 60,000 nuclear weapons when the Cold War ended, and we had 40,000. Though we were just terribly worried about those nuclear weapons getting out to the Chechens, right? And they were just, so what was the most important thing we were doing was worrying about that. And the Congress was of limited help at the moment, at that time. And so if you were, what was I doing? I think I was doing budgets for the Navy at the time. But if you were a red-blooded American person, what you really worried about was loose nukes. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you were an Iowa farmer, you should have been thinking about loose nukes.
That's true. Well, we all were. I remember sitting under my desk in drills in schools, and I think my parents were
Right.
as well.
So I was worrying about loose nukes, and if I were wrong, then that was fair, right? I mean, so I was sacrificed. I'd go out and get a job, hanging drywall. But I had done my share for loose nukes.
Yeah. I wonder if I could highlight another issue in the waning minutes of the discussion here, which is you noted that you participated in war games in the 1980s, showing that U.S. naval doctrine overestimated the effectiveness of U.S. anti-submarine warfare capabilities and underestimated Soviet submarines. There have been a lot of discussions recently about the Chinese, including the PLA Navy, There have been some discussion about the Russians as well in some of the Baltic scenarios. My question to you is, do you have any thoughts as the U.S. shifts its focus from counterterrorism, which is where it was for 2 decades after 9/11, to competition that in many ways has some similarities with the Cold War? I mean, I don't want to overstate that, but now you're talking about competitors, Chinese building capabilities, Russians rebuilding what they lost after the end of the Cold War. So any thoughts you have on kind of naval doctrine and what where the Navy should focus as it begins to compete with countries like China and Russia?
I do, but I've already promised Robbie Harris to devote an hour and a half to that on August 4th at his SDG meeting at 17:30 on his webinar. So Robbie Harris, STG at 17:30 on August 4th.
All right. Well, we'll make sure that's the that folks here tune in. Is there anything else you wanted to highlight that comes from the book or implications for today before we wrap up?
No, I truly believe. I really believe you need, an individual needs to worry about his own abilities. In other words, if you are an introvert, you need to pick tools that work for you. I mean, I've seen introverts that are really effective leaders. I mean, a lot of our effective leaders are introverts, but they pick tools that work for them. And if you pick a tool that an extrovert uses and try to make it work for an introvert, it's not going to work for you. It really isn't. And an extrovert trying to use an introvert's tool, I mean, gee willikers, you just drive the effectiveness is nothing. And so that's the reason I've written 35 different case studies. And I even talk in them, I think you will say, and I say some of these I may have overreached because, I have so much self-confidence. I knew I could drive this, even though I know it wouldn't work with somebody with less self-confidence. So I caution some people not to use this unless you really are comfortable with yourself. So what I'm saying is, read these, pick what's good for you or what's close for you, and then try them and work them and all that sort of thing. I'm not trying to give you a full persona to adapt for yourself, because I don't think that's the way leadership works. I think that's what I'm trying to say in this book. I don't know whether that comes through or not, but and I'm trying to give you some interesting things too, because every now and then I saw something interesting as I was walking around.
Well, it does come through. And with that, Rear Admiral Oliver, I wanted to thank you for joining us today. And I wanted to finish with a plug for the book, A Navy Admiral's Bronze Rules. And as we talked about, the subtitle, Managing Risk and Leadership. So the key parts of the book, using actually an interesting series of case studies to highlight it, including some of the ones that we talked about today. So thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And the book is published by the U.S. Naval Institute, organization we work with pretty regularly. Publication date is August 15th, 2021. So pick it up and read it. And thank you very much for joining us.